Hey wonderful people, it's Genevieve and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. Now today we're going to be drawing a really fun and quite easy, honestly, wintry scene. So grab your drawing tools and let's get started. Now I'm personally going to be working in an app called Procreate on my iPad Pro where you can really follow along with any kind of software of your choice, because here we're mostly going to be focusing on drawing shapes and using specific colors, not so much specific brushes or tool. As a matter of fact, I'm personally only going to use one brush for this entire video. As usual, here in this video, like I always do on my channel, I'm going to suggest a few different kind of brushes you could use. I'm going to suggest free brushes that you're going to find within Procreate. I'm going to try to suggest also some alternatives if you don't have Procreate, of ways essentially to find brushes that would be similar in a different software. And I'm personally going to be using, like I said, one single brush, which is going to be my everything brush that comes within my illustration bundle. So if you have my illustration bundle, go ahead and pick the everything brush. If you want to check it out, I will link it in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people, but it is not essential at all. Again, I'm going to suggest free alternatives if you don't have my bundle. So if you're working with free brushes, I recommend trying to find something that has pencil in the name, but also allows you to draw pretty thick strokes. So if you're working with Procreate, you could go in the sketching pack that comes with the app and pick the 6B pencil. Now, if I increase the size of the 6B pencil to the maximum, it is still pretty small. As you can see, that's the biggest size, and that's not quite big enough for what I want here. But it's really easy to change the maximum and minimum size of a brush within Procreate. All you have to do is just double tap on whatever brush you want to use. So in my case here, the 6B pencil. And if you go on this menu here on the left, you select Properties, which is at the bottom. You're going to see here Brush Behavior, and then you're going to have maximum size and minimum size. So right now my maximum size is 9%, which is really quite small. So if you go ahead and increase that to, I don't know, let's say max, you're going to see if you go back and still with your brush size set to the highest setting, if you go back and draw, now it's much thicker. So that's what I would recommend for Procreate if you're working with the free brushes again, just going with the 6B pencil but increasing the maximum size. Now again, if you're working in a different software, just something that has either pencil or charcoal in the name and also allows you to draw pretty big. Now, like I mentioned though, I'm personally going to be working with my everything brush, which is within my ultimate illustration bundle. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick that. And as you can see, it already allows you to draw pretty big, so you don't necessarily need to change the size of that. In terms of color here, we're essentially going to be drawing the sky. So we're going to find some sort of a dusty blue. Now, I'm personally going to be using this one right here, which as you can see is really desaturated and super, super bright. So it's just essentially this bright gray that has just the tiniest little bit of blue within it. Now, if you want to use the exact same colors I will be using in this video, I'm going to add the X code right here always. And so you could just input that. If you go in the value option here, you can input that in the hexadecimal section right here. That being said, I really encourage you to try and pick your own colors. They don't need to be the exact same ones as the one I am using. You can just always refer to the little clues that I give and then go from there. Now, once we have our little dusty blue, we're going to draw, like I mentioned, the base shape we're going to use. It doesn't need to be precise at all because at the end we're going to draw a frame, a white frame around everything. But we just want to have a very basic rough shape. And you can really use any kind of proportions here. I'm going to go with portrait, but you could go with a square or a landscape. That's really up to you. You would just kind of extend the trees around the cabin. And here I personally want to have texture, so I'm going to manually fill it in, manually color it in, that is. But if you wanted, you could just color drop and have a solid color instead. So from there, we're just going to create a few different layers to map out the different elements we're going to have in our piece, starting with the background and then coming forwards until we have the cabin. So rename this layer we just created with just a rectangle or whatever shape. We're going to rename that to sky. And then on top of that layer, we're going to create a new layer that we're going to rename to mountains. Now the mountains, we want them to be just slightly darker than this sky color. So essentially you could just drag your color towards the bottom right a little bit. Not a whole lot, but just enough so that we can see the difference between the mountain and the sky essentially. And then with the same brush, without really worrying about staying within the shape, because again, we're going to draw a frame around everything at the end, you can go ahead and draw whatever mountain shape you want. So it doesn't need to be the same as I am drawing. You can really have whatever you want here. And it shouldn't be very detailed either because these mountains are very far away in the background. So we're barely going to see essentially just kind of a silhouette of them. And in this video, we're going for something super painterly. So the brush size is going to depend on your canvas size, whatever brush you use, whatever specific element you're drawing, and how you feel comfortable with specific brush sizes. So don't try to necessarily copy what I'm doing in terms of the size, just experiment and then go with what feels right for you. We're drawing something very simple, we're being very rough and quick, so I would say probably going bigger than you think, but really just go ahead and try to see what you feel comfortable with. So once you have this mountain range, we're actually going to go ahead and highlight you. We're not going to go necessarily background towards foreground. We're going to add the snow next, just so we have a better idea of where the lake stops and where the actual, landscape starts. So go ahead and create a new layer above the sky and above the mountains, and rename that new layer to snow. Now for the snow, we're going to stick with the same kind of dusty blue we've been using, but this time we're going to make it really, really super bright. So I think completely desaturated and almost white, but not quite. So I'm going to go with this. And here we're going to go with a slightly smaller brush, and we're going to draw the horizon line. And then on top of the horizontal line, you can go ahead and actually draw the shape you want the snow to be. So I'm going with something really thin on the sides and then slightly thicker around the middle because that's where the cabin is going to be. But otherwise, nothing super precise. The bottom is going to be flat again because it's on the lake, but then the top is going to be wobbly because, well, it's a pile of snow. So now that we have that, we can come back and start putting the trees. So go ahead and create a layer between the mountains and between the snow. And rename that to trees far. Because we're going to have essentially two layers of tree, one that is really far away and one that is surrounding the cabin. So we're going to start with the trees far. And still with the same kind of dusty blue, but this time really quite dark and also fairly desaturated. So it's not fully dark, and it's not fully gray, but something kind of like this, but that has the same hue that we've been using so far. And here we're going to draw trees that are going to be pointy trees, kind of evergreens, and we're going to focus them towards essentially the middle of the height of our mountain range. So again, it doesn't need to be precise in any way, just make sure they're not all the same height, make sure you have some variation, but they're still really quite far, so they're not going to look super precise. And I'm going to stop mine roughly here in the middle because I know I'm going to have the big ones on this side, so there's no point drawing the small ones. And I feel like my small ones might actually be a little bit too dark, so I'm just going to go ahead, make my color a little bit brighter, and then drop it on top of the trees I already drew. And that's one of the really beautiful things about drawing on separate layers when you're working with digital art. Yes, you can move stuff around, that's really handy, but you can also recolor everything as you go. So that means you can be very quick because you don't have to agonize over picking the perfect color. You can just pick something that you think would roughly work, paint everything really quickly, and then come back and change it super easily, which means you can create palettes that are much more intuitive and evoke emotion as opposed to having to know it all from the start. So next we're going to draw the trees that are going to be closer to us. So we're going to create a new layer above the trees far but still below the snow, and we're going to rename that new layers to trees close. Now these trees, we really want them to be quite dark, but quite a bit more saturated as well. So I'm going to go with this to start with, but again, if I feel the need to change it, I'm going to go back and change it very easily, as we've seen. It is almost totally down in terms of the brightness, but it's pretty much middle of the way in terms of saturation. And here, these trees are a bit closer to us, but the details we're going to draw on these trees are going to be mostly the snow. So for the actual tree shape that we're drawing now, we can just still have essentially this cone shape, but we might want to go ahead and add a few trunks on those. Otherwise though, it's very simple. We're just going to draw the same kind of cone shape. And just like for everything, you can see here I'm being very, very loose when I'm coloring my trees so that I have a lot of texture within them. That's going to help when we start adding the snow, make the trees look like they're less opaque. So you can really draw whatever kind of trees you want, however many trees you want. That's totally up to you, whatever configuration you want. One thing I would suggest, which you can kind of see is what I'm doing personally, is keeping the trees on the left side a little bit lower so that you can see the trees far away as well as the mountain range, and then closer to the right, making these trees look a little bit bigger. So it's kind of like this forest here is ending, and you can imagine because the trees are getting bigger, there's the other part of the forest that is starting here and extends toward this side. Now at this stage, if you want, you could also change the color of these trees using the same technique, so going back and either making it darker or brighter. I personally like mine, so I'm just going to keep them as is, but feel free to go ahead and change them. And once you're happy with them, we're going to create a new layer above the tree's clothes layer. And we're going to rename that new layer to, let's just go with trees snow. As long as you understand how your file works, honestly, you can just rename your layers to whatever, but I think it's really important to rename them. Then from there, we're going to color pick the color we use from the snow. You could also find it within the history, but I think color picking is probably the easiest way to go. And what we're going to do is we're going to start drawing the snow on the trees. And the idea here is to remember evergreen trees have these kind of huge, it's not blades, but huge branches. What was I thinking saying blades? Definitely a branch on the tree. These huge branches poking towards us and then towards the side and then towards the back. And it is the front part of those branches that is getting the snow. So what you're going to do is you're going to draw essentially kind of very wiggly little horizontal curved lines that are going to go up on the tree. And essentially every wiggly line would be kind of a cluster of branch. And that might be a little bit tricky. The idea here is to make sure they're fairly different from one another, so they're not exactly the same angle, they're not exactly the same width, they're not exactly the same length, they're not exactly the same opacity, there's like a difference between how they're spaced. So just making sure there is some randomness with how you draw those squiggles. And remember here, we're drawing something very painterly, so it doesn't need to be precise in any way, especially these trees. We want the main focus element on the piece to be the cabin. So the trees can be drawn pretty quickly and just roughly mapped out, essentially, just to give the idea and show that there are snowy trees in the forest, but without distracting from the main element, which is going to be the cabin. So don't agonize over the trees. If you're struggling, don't worry. Honestly, you could even leave them without snow if you're struggling with the snow. In that case, you might go back and just play with the shape of the trees a little bit so they're not quite as flat on the sides. But really, don't make it harder on yourself than it needs to be. Just quickly go over everything. And if you find yourself stuck at this stage, what I recommend is setting yourself a timer. I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes maybe. and doing as much as you can within that timer. And once the timer is done, just move on to the next stage. I find I personally tend to struggle sometimes and just stick on the part that I struggle with and not move on. And honestly, you don't really improve when you do that because you're just kind of agonizing over one thing. I think it is much better in terms of practicing and in terms of investing your time and also enjoyment to give yourself a limited amount of time to try and do something the best you can within that amount of time and then just move it on. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and leave a comment below with the word snow. Now, if you're new on the channel, you might be a little bit confused with that secret password thing. Essentially, it's the game that we play here. In all the long form illustration video, I hide a secret password for you to find. And that does a few things. The most important one being that, believe it or not, it's super simple, but it does give me a lot of insight into how to edit and paste my videos better, and that helps me create better tutorials for you. So again, if you watch this far, just go ahead and leave a comment with the word snow, and we're going to keep going. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I was debating whether or not I should advise you to do this because, again, I don't want you to agonize over these trees, but it might still be helpful, so I'm still going to tell you. If you feel like some areas are too intensely covered in snow, what you can do at this stage is set your eraser to whatever brush you've been using to paint the snow. So if you're working in Procreate with the free brushes, that would mean using the 6B pencil as your eraser. Or if you're working with a different software, something that has pencil or charcoal in a name for your eraser would work well. If you have my illustration bundle though, we might cheat a little bit and actually just pick the eraser shape as our eraser. It's just made for the eraser, so it's going to be a bit better. And then very, very gently at the top of a section, you can come in and just gently erase to help that gradient a little bit. So try to only use that in places where you feel you really messed up. So feel free to pause the video here, take all the time you need to draw your trees, and once you're ready, we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is going to be drawing the cabin. Now the cabin is going to be really easy to draw, believe it or not. We're just going to use a few layers so that we can add a light effect. So we're going to start with one layer above everything we have except for the snow, so above the trees but below the snow. And we're going to rename that layer to Cabin Base. Now I want my cabin to be made of wood, so I'm just going to pick a nice warm brown, but you could have any other color for a different kind of house if you want. Now, like I said, I want wood, so I'm going to go with a really nice, warm, chocolatey brown, which is going to contrast really nicely with this kind of cool grayish blue. I'm going to pick that for now, but I might change it as we go. Again, not a big problem because we're working on separate layers. So for now, as you can see, it's really middle of the way in terms of both brightness and saturation, and it's this kind of burnt red or burnt orange. Otherwise, same brush, we're just going to draw the rough shape of the cabin, starting with a pentagon. Again, coloring it by hand to get that nice texture. Then I'm going to extend the sides here on the top to create the roof shape. I'm just going to zoom in so it's easier to see. Yeah, so extend the top here to create the roof shape, and then I'm just going to connect this little triangle here. From there, we're going to extend the point to create the roof, and draw a copy of that diagonal line just further out. Bring it down, creating our little triangle, but on the back. And then closing the cabin shape. So this is a very rough cabin shape, not super accurate in terms of perspective, but it doesn't matter. Again, we're drawing this painterly style and it's going to look super good in the end. So I think if you try to match it to a grid, it's going to make the illustration look super stiff, and that's definitely not what we want here. So again, we're just going to start with this basic rough shape. I'm also going to add, I have no idea what it would be, like a cellar or a basement entrance or whatever, but essentially this little nub at the back, as well as a nice chimney on the left side. Great. Now once we have that, we're going to define the roof, and the roof is actually just going to be snow. So go ahead and create a new layer and rename that new layer to Cabin Snow. Make sure it is above the cabin base, otherwise we won't see it, but still below the snow layer that we have. And then go ahead and make your brush slightly smaller so that you can be a little bit more precise, and then simply go over the edges of the roof. Oh, and don't forget to add a bit of snow in the chimney as well. And a little bit on whatever that is in the back here. So any kind of plane that is at the top is going to have a little bit of snow. Now from there, we're also going to add these kind of architectural elements, I guess, just to make the cabin a little bit more interesting. So create a new layer between the cabin snow and the cabin base, and rename those to, let's go with cabin details. Now here we're going to color pick the base color we used, and we're going to make it a little bit brighter. And here you can really draw whatever kind of architectural elements you want. I'm going to draw these two essentially kind of supporting beams on the side. Then one other beam that runs across horizontally, kind of like this, or maybe a bit higher actually. Yeah, something like that. And then just a decoration at the top, so a vertical line and two diagonal lines. And maybe 2 more support beams that are going to frame the door and just really bring attention to this middle part of the cabin. Might add another support beam here. Yeah, something like that. Now our cabin is really flat, so we're going to go back on the cabin base layer and we're going to add a bit of a shadow effect, which is going to help these architectural elements really pop. Now you could go ahead and just draw those shadows on the cabin layer as it is right now, but to make it a little bit easier on ourselves, we're going to activate what is called alpha lock on that cabin base layer. And with alpha lock activated, it means everything we draw is now going to stay within the shape that we already have, so we can just go very quickly and brush in our shadows. So to activate alpha lock in Procreate, all you have to do is take 2 fingers and swipe your layer towards the right. And you can also activate it from the layer menu, so just tapping on the layer and then selecting alpha lock. You can see I already have a check mark because it worked with my 2 fingers. But if for some reason it doesn't work for you, you always have the option to, again, yes, just activate it from this menu here. With alpha lock activated, we're going to be able to just really quickly brush in our shadows. So just going back to whatever color you use for the cabin base and make it quite a bit darker and more saturated as well. And then use that to brush in on the top of the cabin. Now we're also going to add a lit up door, kind of like it was a glass door and there was a lot of light within the cabin. It's still not super realistic. If it was that bright, it's probably because the cabin is on fire, but it looks really good, so we're still going to do it. So go ahead and create a new layer above the cabin base, but below the cabin details, and rename that new layer to door. Now for the door itself, we're going to pick a really nice, bright, orangey yellow. So probably just fully bright, completely white, and probably quite desaturated as well. So this kind of banana color essentially. And then with that, you can just go ahead and draw a rectangle for the door. Now this is probably the element you want to spend the most time on, believe it or not, in the whole piece, because it's essentially the focal element. So you want to make sure that it is really nice and crisp and exactly the right shape. It's not super complicated, but make sure you really like your door shape. As crazy as it sounds again, if you feel like you need to take 10 minutes on that door shape, well, that's exaggerated. But if you feel like you need to spend 2 or 3 minutes, that's worth it. You really need to make sure you're super happy with it. And once you are super happy with it, we're going to make it glow, because right now it just looks like a weird banana door. So go ahead and duplicate that door layer. In Procreate, you can just swipe your layer towards the left with 1 finger and then tap on duplicate. And to create the glow effect, we're going to use a blending mode. Now most software do have blending modes and they're usually located with the opacity of your layer, so it should be pretty easy to find. In Procreate, you can just tap on the little N next to the check mark right here. And we're going to pick the blending mode called Add. As you can see already, it looks like the door is glowing. But to make it glow even more, we're going to add any kind of blur that is available to you. So often you're going to find something like Gaussian blur. That would be the optimal option. If you just have regular blur, that's totally okay as well. And in Procreate, you can find that blur within the adjustment panel here at the top. Gaussian blur. And then if you swipe your finger towards the right, it's going to add blur. And if you swipe it towards the left, it's going to decrease the blur. So you can really set it to whatever you want here. I'm probably going to set mine around 13–14% for now. But I might decrease the opacity of that glow a little bit because right now it's super intense. So I'm just going to play with the opacity until I find something I like. I think 50% is good for me. And I'm also going to rename that layer so it's not door twice. but so that the top copy is now glow. Now, if we want to be very precise here, we might go back and add a bit of light on these architectural elements, because if the door is glowing, it's going to hit these beams and make them look like they're kind of glowing a little bit as well. So you can go back on your cabin details layer and essentially just color pick one of the brown that is around your door. So that's really going to depend on a bunch of settings. So just make sure you color pick for your own color. I'm not even going to have the X code. And then make your brush quite a bit smaller and just draw the outlines of those architectural elements when they're facing the door. So for example, here, the bottom of the beam is facing the door. These side of the beams are facing the door. You get the idea. Now, in this same vein, in terms of being a little bit more precise, before moving on to the lake, which is the last thing we're going to have to do, we might go back in and add a few details on the snow and on the trees. So if you go back on your snow layer at the very top, go ahead and select that. And here you can actually go ahead and pick pure white and just zooming in and adding tiny little dots of pure white onto your snow. It might not even look any different on the screen in my video right now. It is such a subtle little thing, but it can help bring the piece up a little notch. And you can also highlight the front of the snow where it's close to the door. So kind of like what we did on the beams, but on the snow layer here. But honestly, you can barely tell the difference, so don't spend too much time on this. Now, what's going to make a little bit more of a difference though is adding some snow on these trees, but we don't want it to be nearly as precise as these trees, because otherwise they're going to compete a lot and we're not really going to see the difference in distance. So instead of drawing snow on these trees, what we're going to do is we're just going to lightly erase the top to make it look kind of powdery. So go back on your trees far layer and picking the same eraser you use, which should be set to the same brush you're using, making it quite a bit bigger, and also maybe lowering the opacity of your eraser just to make sure you don't completely erase the top of the tree. So the opacity doesn't need to be super precise, probably around 50%. And then you can just very gently erase the top of the trees. So you can see it's really subtle, but it does help make them look a little bit more powdery, and it helps the piece feel a little bit more magical too. And we're going to do the same thing for the mountains, so just go ahead and pick your mountains layer. And otherwise, same thing, maybe with an even bigger version of your brush, just gently erasing the top of the mountains. Be careful though, the mountains are really close in color to the sky, so if you erase too much, they're just going to completely disappear, so it's barely anything you're going to do here. Now, while we are on the mountains layer though, we're going to go ahead and erase the part of the mountains that is within the lake, because otherwise we're going to struggle a little bit. So bring the opacity of your eraser back to 100% and then go back and just erase that bottom section. Now, creating the lake itself is going to be really quite easy and very satisfying because we already have pretty much every single element we need except for some little like ice lines. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to group all of the layers we have except for the sky. So in Procreate, to group layers, all you have to do is just swipe them towards the right with one finger. So from mountains to snow. And then we're going to select the group option. And from there you can click on the little arrow here to collapse the group. And for now, just rename this group to real. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but bear with me. Now, once we have this group, we're also going to duplicate this group. So just swiping it towards the left with one finger if you're working with Procreate, and just picking the duplicate option. And we're going to pick the bottom copy and rename that one to lake. Now, with the lake copy selected, we're going to use any kind of mirroring tool we have in our software. So in Procreate, it is here in the arrow. It's probably going to be for you if you're working in different software in any kind of transformation menu you have. But the idea here is find any flip vertical option you have. So in Procreate, again, in the arrow tool option, you're going to have flip vertical here at the bottom, which is going to allow us to create that reflection in the lake and the ice. Now the reflection is going to be a little bit distorted, so what we're going to do is we're going to, still with our transformation tool, setting it to freeform, we're going to squish it so it's not quite as tall. So we're going to squish it essentially until the bottom of the snow that we have in our reflection touch the bottom of the snow in the real part of the illustration. So as you can see here, we already have a pretty good lake. It just looks a little bit too close to the reality. So what we're going to do is we're going to flatten this lake group. So you can just tap on the group and select flatten. Otherwise, any kind of merging option you have is going to work well. And make sure that when you do that, it doesn't change the name. In Procreate, it picks the name of the last layer, which is really annoying. So I'm just going to change it back to lake. And then we're going to lower the opacity of that lake layer, probably around 50%. You can experiment with different things, but just to make it look a little bit more subdued because it is a reflection, it's not the real deal. Now to help make it look even more like snow, we're going to add some very simple little lines that are going to look like the lines that appear in very thick ice. So go ahead and create a new layer above your lake layer, but below your real layer, and rename that one to ice lines. And we're going to stick with pure white for this, as well as a fairly small brush. And then you can just draw really whatever kind of squiggly lines you want. One thing I would recommend to make it look even more realistic, although again, we're not going with something super realistic here, is to make sure the lines that are further away are a little bit thinner and the lines that are closer towards you a little bit thicker. So when you're drawing in the back, if you have a pencil and a brush that is sensitive to pressure, press very lightly and press harder the closer you get to the front. Now once you have those lines, feel free to go ahead and just scroll through the list of blending modes you have to see if there's one that you like. I probably am going to go with either overlay or soft light. I'm not quite sure yet. I think soft light looks really good. But I really encourage you to just scroll and see if there's something that you like for yourself. You can also play with opacity. But again, I'm personally going to go with soft light. Now we're also going to add a bit of a gradient in the ice, just again to reinforce the ice effect and make it look a little bit less like a perfect reflection. So go ahead and create a new layer above the ice line, but below our real group. And rename that new layer to ice gradient. Still with pure white, but with a bigger brush here, what we're going to do is we're going to create that gradient by just very gently brushing and kind of releasing the brush when we get towards the middle of the lake. And it doesn't need to be perfect in any way, but as you can see, it just helps blend the piece and make the lake look more like a lake. Once more, feel free to scroll through the list of the blending modes and see if there's one that you like. I'm personally going to go with overlay and I'm going to keep my opacity at 100%. And the last thing we're going to do is just draw a white frame around the piece because right now we drew everything really quickly and it's kind of spilling everywhere. You could keep it like that. Honestly, that has a really nice vibe to it. But if you want to frame it in and make it a little bit more clean, just go ahead and create a new layer above everything you have. Rename that new layer to frame. And still with pure white, and any size brush allows you to be precise enough for what you want. Go ahead and draw your frame. Now, if you enjoyed this tutorial and want to learn how to animate falling snow in front of your scene, I highly recommend you check out this video because I'm going to show you exactly how to do it step by step. It's super easy. But before you leave, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos I post every Tuesday and Saturday. And click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.